I don't like her because she's leaving us. And I'm very
Can y'all hear me okay? Without a mic? Yeah. Okay, for those that don't know, I'm John F. Baker Jr. I'm the author of the Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, Stories of My Family's Journey to Freedom. My journey started when I was a 7th grader, and we used a social studies textbook called Your Tennessee, and this is a photograph of it. And while I was in class, I was flipping through the social studies book, and I came across this photograph entitled Black Tennesseans. But I had no clue at that time that I was actually staring at my own great-great-grandparents. And each time I would go to class, I would look at it thinking that I had seen people that resembled them, but I had no clue who it really was. So shortly after I got out of 7th grade for summer vacation, I think it was Wessyngton's 150th anniversary or so, and they had a photograph of the white Washington family, and they also had this photograph. This time they had their names listed. Seated left was Emmanuel Washington, and he was born here at Wessyngton April 23rd, 1824. His wife seated next to him, Henny Washington, was born May 26, 1839. Standing left was Allen Washington, and he was born here September 1825. And standing right was Granville Washington, born January 17, 1831. So my grandmother was visiting from Chicago with one of her older brothers, and at the conclusion of her visit, she called my mother and told my mother to bring a camera out to her brother's house. And I said, Mama, why does Big Mama want me to bring a camera out to Uncle Bob's? And she said, just do like she said and you'll find out when you get there. So when I got there and my grandmother showed me the newspaper article, I said, Big Mama, that picture's in our history book. Who is that? And she said the couple seated were her grandparents. And she said, my grandfather was the cook, which everyone refers to this as the Washington farm. And so she said, my grandfather was the cook on the Washington farm, and that's how we got the Washington name. So my great uncle knew them personally, but my grandmother didn't. So my great uncle told me that the white Washington family still lived here at Wessyngton. So I called him up the very next morning and told him that I had seen the newspaper article and I was interested in my family's history. So Ann Talbot, who was a 6th-generation descendant of Joseph Washington, who founded this plantation in 1796, said, well, of course I know who your great-great-grandfather was, because his portrait is still in the living room. So at that time, she ran a bookstore in Springfield, which was within walking distance of my house. So I went there, and she brought a portrait of my great-great-grandfather, some legal-sized documents which recorded the births of the slaves on the plantation. So from that moment on, I was totally excited about my family's history, and I've been researching mine and everyone else's associated with the plantation ever since. This is a photograph of Joseph Washington, and Joseph was born in Southampton County, Virginia, July 8, 1770. He first came to Robertson County in 1796, bringing slaves with him. On his first trip, he visited the home of his cousin, Colonel Archer Cheatham. And at that time, this lady was a small baby, small enough to be carried in the arms. So someone said, Joseph, you being a bachelor, when are you going to get married? And he said, well, I'll just wait for her to grow up and I'll marry this little girl. So that's what he did in 1812 when she was 16 and he was 42. Which her father was the wealthiest man in the county, so that probably helped. After his death in 1848, the plantation passed on to his son, George Augustine Washington, and he was born here at Wessyngton in 1815. This is his wife, Jane Smith Washington, and she was born in Florence, Alabama in 1830, and she died in 1894 in Nashville with one of her daughters. When I first met Mrs. Talbot at her bookstore, she brought out about 8 to 10 legal-sized documents which recorded the births of the slaves on the plantation from 1795 to 1860. So I was able to use this and other documents to trace my ancestry and all the others on the plantation. This is a portrait of my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and he was born here in 1824. He died here in 1907, and he's buried in the slave cemetery here. The Washington family commissioned the famous artist Maria Howard Wheaton to paint my great-great-grandfather's portrait during the late 1800s, and the original portrait is still in possession of some of the Washington family descendants. In the 1960s, the Washington family donated all their records to the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville. It's 11,200 documents. There are many letters. It's on 69 rolls of microfilm, and I've gone through all of these documents many, many times. There are letters on the plantation where George A. Washington traveled to New Orleans when they sold the tobacco crops. He would go to Maryland and Virginia to purchase slaves, and he would go to New York to invest in the stock market. So while he was gone, his wife, his mother, his father, and the plantation overseer would write letters, what's going on the plantation, which slave had a baby, who ran away, who died. There's even one letter that mentions the Cherokees on the Cherokee removal coming through here. So there are lots and lots of documentation, especially during the Civil War period, so much so that I feel that I know most of these individuals personally. This is a copy of an actual slave bill of sale. And this is one of the earliest families that we can trace back. It's actually a bill of sale for my great-great-great-grandmother, and her name was Jenny. She was the mother of Emmanuel Washington. Originally, her family was owned by Colonel Michael Blow in Sussex County, Virginia. He had a large plantation of about 50 slaves. He passed away in 1799, and 15 of our family members went to his son, Micajah Blow. And then shortly thereafter, he began to have financial difficulties. So he mortgaged some of the land that he inherited, and he sold my great-great-great-grandmother, who was 10 years old, and her sister, who was 12, her name was Sarah, to Joseph Washington, and he brought them here to Tennessee, and there's been 11 generations of our family that's lived here continuously since that time. This is a photograph of some of the slave cabins here at Wessyngton. In 1860, there were 40 log cabins which housed 274 slaves, which was the largest slave population at that time in the state of Tennessee. Okay, you will notice if you look back there, there's a fence, and across that fence, the cabins were arranged sporadically down the hillside. And so typically slave owners would line their cabins up in neat little rows so they could observe all the activities of the slaves, but due to the lay of the land here, that was not possible. And when I started my research, there was probably about 10 to 12 cabins still standing. And here's another shot of some of the cabins in about 1895. Here's another document that I used to trace my ancestry and the others. It's a tax list from 1860. Slave owners had to pay taxes on their slaves when they were 12 to 50 years old. So this list, each person in a household is classified as being taxable. Children or older people are not listed on this list. So I went back and took other documents and recreated all the families, adding their exact dates of birth and the names to complete their families.
It seems like they took really good records compared to some slave
Well,
owners.
most people that owned slaves had to keep records, but theirs just happened to survive. Now this was a photograph of a group of women processing pork after a hog killing here on the plantation. And someone will be at the smokehouse, which is still standing, and they'll tell you more about how the plantation operated and what went on there. Each week the women would line up and they'd be given so many pounds of meal, pork, sugar, flour, depending on the number of individuals in their families. So I've been very fortunate to been able to collect so many photographs from the Washington family and some of the slave descendants. This is a photograph of a tobacco field here at Wessyngton, and in 1860, Wessyngton was the largest tobacco plantation in America. The slaves produced 250,000 pounds of tobacco, which would have required at least 350 acres of land under cultivation. The entire Wessyngton plantation at that time was 13,100 acres here in Robertson County in one continuous farm. They also owned property in Todd, Logan, Trigg, and Simpson counties, Kentucky, and some counties in Tennessee. The slaves here at Wessyngton worked under a task system. And so the owner would set a task, and they had so many acres of tobacco or corn or what have you to chop out. And after this was completed, they could raise their own tobacco crops. Of course, they knew about how much an average man could do in a day, so they set the task so that was going to take up most of your day. But some of the fastest workers could accomplish this earlier, and then they raised their own tobacco crops. They were not required to work at all on Sunday and half a day on Saturday. So during this time, they would raise their own crops. So this list is from the 1840s, listing various individuals who raised crops here on the plantation and how much money they were given when the produce was sold in New Orleans.
Were these records traditionally kept by plantations, or was this unusual?
They, most people had to keep records like that, but most of them have not survived.
Sir, if they got their own money, what could they use it for?
Okay. They would ship the tobacco to Clarksville. They would have mule-drawn wagons and take it to Clarksville. Then they would put it on boats, and then it would be taken down to New Orleans. So the slaves would give, Mr. Washington would take the money that they would do from their crops, and so they would tell him different things that they wanted him to purchase while he was in New Orleans, like clothing, hats, pots, pans, coats, luxury items, watches, jewelry, and various things. Yes.
Now, it sounds like the slaves here were treated reasonably well given the circumstances. Is that common of the period?
What do you mean reasonably well based on?
Given the circumstances of the day, from what you're saying.
Like under the task system, one thing.
I mean, it sounds like, and looking at your records, it sounds like they live to be reasonably old people.
Well, that's genetics.
Okay, okay. I mean, but I'm surprised. I mean, from the movies you see on TV and everything.
Well, some things are embellished, so.
Yeah, I know.
John, did they get the same price for their tobacco as the West?
He would give them a third of the proceeds. It was similar to a sharecropping. And so one thing, this was a method of control as well, because from their standpoint, well, they were so wealthy that they never had to sell any of the slaves off the plantation, with two exceptions. From 1795 to 1860, they sold 2 slaves, so they had their families intact, and that was one of the main reasons that people ran away. So they had, that's one method of control, that I'm allowing you to raise crops, and you have money where the other slaves in the community may not have what you all have. So that's, a method of control as well. Now, I was very fortunate in my research. I was able to interview probably 20 to 25 individuals who ranged in age from 80 to 107 years old. This gentleman was Joseph Washington, and I met him on his 102nd birthday. And he lived next door to my great-great-grandfather and mother. And so when I went to visit him, I asked him, did he know him? He said, well, of course I knew them. We lived in handshaking distance. And I said, handshaking distance? What's that? And he said, our houses were so close that you could reach over and shake their hand. And so he told me that my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel, had a beautiful singing voice, and he used to lead most of the songs in their services. And so he even sang some of them for me. He died a couple of weeks before he turned 107, and he had perfect mind and memory. And I hope I won't break our record. This lady is Ann Nixon Cooper, and she died 19 days before she turned 108 years old. And she was raised by a Wessyngton slave in Nashville, and she later married and moved to Atlanta. You may have seen her on CNN. President Obama mentioned her voting for him when she was 106 years old. And up to 104 years old, she could dance and do the electric slide in high heel shoes. This is Rachel Washington Terry and Wiley Terry, and both of them were born slaves here. And I got this portrait from their daughter, who passed away a week before she turned 103 years old. Wiley and 2 of his sons purchased 429 acres of land, part of which was once Wessyngton, and some of that land is still in possession of their direct descendants. And this is their son, Sally Terry, with his wife and family, in front of their 1918 Model T Ford, and they're the first African-American family that we can document that owned the car. They also donated some of their land to start the Sandy Springs School. After emancipation, some of the slaves returned to Wessyngton, and this is a photograph of my great-great-grandfather and mother with some of their children and grandchildren in front of their cabin. And some people say, well, why did they return to Wessyngton where they were enslaved? Well, some of the slaves, after they left here, went to work for some of the other former slaves or landowners or farmers, and some of them worked a year and then they didn't have the money to pay them. So they knew that Mr. Washington was even wealthier after the war than he was before, so they knew at least that he would be able to pay them. So that was one of the reasons that they returned here to Wessyngton. This lady is Marion Sims Green, and she was born a slave here at Wessyngton, and her father was the plantation overseer, Benjamin Sims. And this is her husband, and both of them moved to Nashville after emancipation, and many of you know where Odie Center is. So they're direct descendants. The Odies are their direct descendants through the Greens.
Wow.
After emancipation, and when some of the slaves left, the Washingtons hired other African Americans and whites to sharecrop here at Wessyngton. And this is a photograph of Fannie Williams and Wesley Williams, and I got this photograph from their granddaughter, Carrie Washington, who passed away when she was 99. And many of her direct descendants said she was full-blooded Native American. Some said she was half. Some said she was 3/4. I did research on 3 of her children's death certificates, all listed her with a different maiden name. Census record listed that she was born in Virginia, Tennessee, and West Virginia. And all of them listed that she was black. So I grew up with her great-great-grandchildren, and one of them, Charles Gardner, and I was discussing, what was told about the Native American ancestry. So I had him to take a DNA test going back through his maternal line. And so it showed that she had African ancestry through her mother's line. Then I had another lady who was her great-granddaughter to take a DNA composition test, which will say that you're 90% African, that you're 10% European, or 10% Native American. So she came back with 18% Native American, which is extremely high for African Americans, which would have been about equivalent if she would have been half Native American. And they said, and the house that she actually lived in is still standing. And we'll go to a restored slave cabin, and I'll show you where the house was. They said she was extremely mean, and she poisoned one of her daughters-in-law to death that she did not like. And she was said to be a fortune teller and used to tell fortunes with decks of cards. This is a white family of sharecroppers here at Wessyngton, and this was taken in the late 1890s. And any of you that's ever worked in tobacco know it's very hard, dirty, back-breaking work. And you can tell by these little boys' expressions that they're not thrilled about being out. This lady here is with her school class in the early 1900s, and she is the daughter of a Wessyngton slave. And I got this from one of her granddaughters when I did a book tour in Evansville, Indiana, a couple of years ago. This is Granville Washington, and he was the valet of George A. Washington. He was also said to be his son. And this was taken in Adams, Tennessee in 1892. Granville moved to Nashville and purchased a home on Division Street in Nashville in the 1890s, and he committed suicide in 1898. And he's buried at Mount Airy Cemetery there in Nashville.
Did they say why?
One obituary made it sound like he had mental problems on the end, and then another one made it he had been suffering from an illness, and at various points he would get out of his mind. So they think that's when that happened. And this is his son, the coachman, Foster Washington, and he was born here in 1852. He moved to Dixon County, and some of his direct descendants are still living there. Yes,
Do
ma'am.
we know his mother's name?
Yes.
You had that in the book, but what about any other children she had? Do we know?
She didn't have any other children that I know of. Her name was Fanny, and she was born in 1815.
Yeah.
And this is a photograph I've got from a lady in Evansville when I was doing a book signing, and this is members of the Antioch Baptist Church. Antioch Baptist Church was founded in 1869 by former slaves and others in this community. And the first pastor was Edmund White Washington, who was a former slave here.
Does it still exist?
Yes. Several years ago.
What do you mean Wessyngton? What is it called?
Okay, the Wessyngton got its name. The Washington's first ancestor was William D. Hurtburn, and he lived in the 12th century. And for military service, one of the kings of England gave him an estate called Wessyngton. So they became known as D. Wessyngton, and so when the family came to America in 1656, they used Washington and used that name thereafter. So the Washingtons that founded this place named the place Wessyngton in honor of their ancestors. Okay. Okay. This is a portrait of my great-great-grandmother and father, Emmanuel and Henry Washington, and Sarah Jane Scott, who was also a slave in Wessyngton. And Mr. Scott here is her great-great-great-nephew. I worked with a team of archaeologists at Wessyngton to get the slave cabin area on the National Register of Historic Places. So one of the archaeologists said, "John, I've got a picture of your great-great-grandfather and mother," and I thought for sure it was the one of the 4 of them out in the yard. And I said, "That picture's everywhere." So when he showed me this one, I'd never seen it before. So I said, "Where did you get that?" And he said, "This lady, she's a white Washington descendant, and she lives in Lake Placid, New York. And she sent it to us when she found out we were doing a dig here." And so I called her up and told her who I was. She said, "I'm so happy to hear from you." She said, "My father had this picture 50 or 60 years and then passed it on to me." And she said, "When I was a child, my father could tell you exactly how all the former slaves were related to one another because they helped raise them there on the plantation." And she said, "When I was a little girl, my father would take me on a horse all across the plantation, and he would tell me different stories about various people." and she said he told me showed me where the slave cemetery was, and she said, you know what? I always felt sad when he showed me the slave cemetery because they didn't have markers on their graves, and I thought our family should have done something about that. And she said, well, you know, it's not too late to do something about it. And she said, if you find names of people that's buried there, she said, I'll pay to have a monument erected in their honor. So she did that in about 1994. And this is standing in the slave cemetery, and those that feel like it, I can take you out there with sort of a difficult walk if you want to go. But she paid to have a monument erected there, and it's there now. And 2 years ago, another Washington descendant donated funds to have a fence put up around the slave cemetery.
How many names did you say there?
It was 39 at that time, and in December, we had ground penetrating radar, and they estimate that there's at least 200 individuals that's buried there, but the test is not complete yet. Mr. Washington passed away in 1892. He held over $1 million in stocks and bonds. He was president of several railroads, so he was very prominent. He'd probably be classified as a billionaire in today's terms. So when he passed away, he left a stipulation in his will. He wanted his son, Joseph E. Washington, to get Wessyngton, which was called the home place. The rest of the children drew lots out of a hat to determine what part of the 13,100 acres would be their inheritance. So his son, George Augustine Washington II, built this home called Washington Hall. It was 3-story, white brick with 44 rooms. Some of the crown heads of Europe had been entertained there. And all of you, no doubt, have seen Gone with the Wind and recall the staircase that Scarlett O'Hara falls down. Well, it was fashioned after the staircase here in Washington Hall.
Where was that located?
It was down the road,
on
and
this
then there was a gate that says Washington Hall. If y'all came this way, okay, you passed it coming down here.
The house
it was
is still there?
It was a gate over on the right that said Washington Hall, so it was there. So you'll see it going back toward Adams. Then Mr. Washington's daughter, Jane Washington Ewing, built this home called Glen Raven. And she and her brother stayed in a fierce competition with one another, having lavish parties, trying to outdo one another, and they both went broke in the process. So it doesn't pay to keep up with the Joneses.
Even if you're in your family, right?
So many of you no doubt heard the controversy about Thomas Jefferson, some of his slaves claiming descent from him. So I thought about them using DNA, and I said, well, I know, literally thousands of people in Springfield whose ancestors came from Wessyngton. So I approached various ones of them and asked them were they interested in taking DNA tests to find out their ethnic origins in Africa, what tribes they came from. So I had tests done on about 30 individuals, and this is a map, and this also in my book, that shows where the various families from Wessyngton's ancestry came from. Now, a number of people have asked me, how many years have you been doing research, John? And this is about 37 now. So, and a lot of people say, well, you mean it takes 30-something years to trace your family tree? And I said, no, but it takes 30 years to trace 300 people's family tree. I traced everybody's family that came from here. And what happened, when I would interview various people, I would become as interested in their family's history as I did my own. So I ended up tracing theirs. This is a family tree of my, goes back to my to my 5th great-grandmother, born in 1760, and it comes down to 2012, and it's over 1,000 direct descendants on this particular tree.
Where are you on this?
Way down here. Way down the bottom.
I'm right here in 1962.
Oh, and there are that many more after you.
So I've done this pretty much for every family that came from the plantation. So the Gardner family in Springfield, they're the largest African-American family carrying the same surname, and they've been having a family reunion every year since 1935. And so as part of their family's reunion, I bring them here to Wessyngton and tell them about their family's history.
What an assumption.
Pardon?
Nothing. That was cool. That's cool. I mean, that is cool.
Okay. For many, many years, my mother's been telling me, John, she said, you can tell anything about the people at Wessyngton off the top of your head. And she said, I was a valedictorian of my class. I could look at something once and do just like you can. And she said, now I can't remember where I put my keys. So she said, it would be a shame, all that information that you've got, she said, you've got it in your head, you've got it in drawers, under the bed, in the closet, everywhere. If something happened to you, and then it's going to be, down the drain because nobody can come back and recreate it because some of the people that's giving you information have passed and they wouldn't be able to find it in books. So I thought about what my mother said, and for a number of years, I was pulling all this information together. So a lot of people say, well, John, you've been saying for years that you're writing a book. How you know you're going to get it published? And I said, well, I believe at the time, my only interest is getting it finished. I believe the Lord will make a way for me to get it published when the time comes. So when I got it completed, of course, book publishers will not take anything from the general public, so you have to get an agent. So I went online and looked for various people that had gotten books published. So one guy named Paul Bresnick, as soon as I saw his picture, it came in my mind, that's who's going to get your book published. So I prepared 10 book proposals and sent them to various agents in New York in the middle of February 2007. I did the same thing in the middle of March. And in the middle of April, I was getting ready to send another set out. So Paul Bresnick, who was one of the original I sent, said, Mr. Baker, I get 300 and something submissions a week. And I'm just now getting to yours, but I believe I can get it published. And this was on, I think, Friday. So he said, let me keep it over the weekend and look over it. And he said, I'll get back with you and let you know if I'll represent you or not. So I worked at Verizon Wireless for 20 years, and two of my friends here, they worked there as well. We worked there together. So he called me while I was at work, and sent me an email, and I got it, but I couldn't answer him back at the time. So he called me and said, Mr. Baker, I want to represent you if you'll have me. And I said, okay. So then by Wednesday, he had a contract for me to sign as him as my agent. So he said, I'm going to send this out to all the major book publishers and see what happens. So I guess about 6 weeks later, he called me and said, Mr. Baker, Simon & Schuster made an offer to publish your book. So it went just like that. And he said, I don't know who you know, but I said, the Lord. So that's who I know. So he made that way for that to be possible. So the title of my book is The Washingtons of Wessyngton Plantation, and subtitle, Stories of My Family's Journey to Freedom. But it's not just my family, it's all the families that was here, the White Washington family and all the other families, the Scotts, the Greens, the Cheathams, the Gardners, the Terrys, and many, many others. And when I was on a book signing tour in Evansville a couple of years ago, this lady was about 90 years old, and she was spry as could be, and she said, I'm going upstairs and get me a jazz tape and I'll be back. I want 2 books. And so then she looked at the picture and she said, I've got that picture among my mother's things. And I thought, that picture's everywhere. And so she said, I'm sure I've got that picture, but it's real old. So she took my name and phone number. When I got back home, she called me. She said, I was right. She said, I do have that picture and it's real old. And I said, really? And she said, on the back of it, it's got something, but I can't hardly read it. It says Uncle something. I said, man. Well, my great-great-grandfather's name was Emmanuel, but everyone here called him Uncle Man. And she said, yeah, that's what it says. So she sent it to me. She said, this is the original. And she said, you should have it. So on the back of it said Uncle Man, and he had purchased 2 copies of it for 40 cents each, which he was making 50 cents a day as the cook. Wow. So I got the original picture. So after the book was completed, Rob DeHart and some of the other members of the Tennessee State Museum read the book and thought it would be a good exhibit. So that's how the Slaves and Slaveholders exhibit came to be. And so that's all of my time. So they're going to have various people. Somebody's going to be at the Washington Cemetery and tell a story there. Rob's going to be at the kitchen and tell about the architecture of the house. Someone's going to be at the barn, I think, and tell something. Then someone's going to be at the smokehouse. And then, how much time we have?
Actually, we're going to take about half an hour.
Pardon?
If you want to use the restroom, 30 minutes. 30 minutes. If you want to use the bathroom, now's a good time if you want to walk back to the bus and do that. If you need water, you can grab some by the van, or if you want to buy a book or DVD, you can do that by the van. And then meet us here a little after 11:30. And we'll split up to go to the place and
Okay, how many want to go to the slave cemetery? Now, it's a steep walk. You have to go. I want you to be aware of it. You have to go down a steep hill, then you have to go up another steep hill.
How long the walk? I mean, you said 20 minutes, but what's the distance? It's just the hills that make it slower?
Yeah.
How steep are the hills?
They're pretty steep.
Are
If
the
you're not
steep both ways, going up and coming down?
going down, yeah, you coming back up, it's pretty steep. So I wouldn't recommend it if you have problems walking.
Okay.
'Cause it's a steep little hike. But
I got bad knees.
if you got bad knees, you don't need to go.
They took that picture. I mean, what was happening that?
Okay, the